No, dude, this should have just used this red. I'm getting reds.
Whose idea was this? Who decided that putting Mercy's ultimate into the slot of a basic ability was a good idea? The original single target Resurrect took Mercy's former ultimate and nerfed it repeatedly. The limitless target potential was replaced with a single target effect. The range was reduced from 15 meters to 5 meters, and a line of sight requirement was instituted. It was then put into a basic ability slot with a 30-second cooldown, a duration that blew every other static cooldown in the game at the time out of the water. There were exceptions to this 30-second cooldown during Valkyrie, but those exceptions were incrementally removed because Mercy was brokenly overpowered. When that wasn't working, they incrementally nerfed Resurrect directly, first by removing the Guardian Angel reset upon activation, and later by adding an interruptible cast period with movement penalties. The 1.75 second cast time, combined with a 75% movement speed penalty, was supposed to be the nuclear option that would finally bring the post-rework Mercy in line with the other supports, but it didn't. That was November 16th of 2017, and anyone who was around during that time may recall that Overwatch had another 7 months of Moth meta ahead of it. The developers tried a few more nerfs to the availability of Resurrect, but by now they were running out of things to nerf about the ability, and Mercy was still overpowered. Anyone who had a clue about Resurrect during Mercy's 1.x versions would have taken the hint long before it got to this point. And, well, it's as obvious as it is unfortunate that the developers did not overlap with this group of people. I'll go ahead and put the disclaimer here that this video isn't just about E-Resurrect. The context of Mass Resurrect is necessary to explain both what makes E-Resurrect objectively problematic and how it fails to fill the void left by its predecessor. Before the rework, Resurrect was complicated. The big question surrounding the ability was not should I use it, but how should I use it? The answer to that question varied by a lot depending upon the situation. Large-scale resurrections were flashy and looked really cool on a highlight reel, but they were also incredibly risky. I covered this when I discussed the preconditions for the rework in a previous video, but the gist is that Resurrect fundamentally gives the positioning and first strike advantages to the enemy team on each revived ally. Those freshly revived allies need someone to cover them, and when there are more players stuck in the revive animation, there are fewer players available to provide that cover. The ideal situation as a Mercy player would be to use Resurrect when only 1 or 2 allies are dead, as that ensures that there are other allies around to cover for the reviving players. All of that said, I must once again reiterate that Mass Resurrect was complicated because there's a totally different dimension I haven't discussed yet: enemy ultimates. You see, Resurrect was one of the 3 abilities in the game that was reliable when it came to countering any combination of enemy ultimates. These abilities were scarce and in high demand. The chances of a Mercy player having Resurrect every time they needed to counter an enemy ultimate were slim, never mind having it for every potential tempo resurrection as well. Limited and inconsistent availability combined with the necessity to contend with enemy ultimates dampened the power of Resurrect. It now occasionally needed to be used for larger scale resurrections, which were much easier to counter. This diluted the raw power of the ability, as it can no longer be regularly used in its most powerful form. Of course, the developers, as clueless as they were, did not realize that they were taking Resurrect and removing the only 2 things preventing it from being used in its purest form. Its new adaptation forced the ability to be used strictly for tempo resurrections, the most powerful application of the ability. At that point, it didn't matter what other aspects of the ability you nerfed. The difference in potency was like going from routine smoking to injecting straight fentanyl. And somehow, the developers didn't see this coming. Even more embarrassing is the fact that even though the problem became painfully obvious to anyone who paid attention, the developers insisted upon their inherently broken design. 13 nerfs from the original PTR version, and somehow nobody on the team stopped to wonder why they had to apply so many nerfs in the first place. Nobody seemed to realize that the restrictions they were placing on the ability matched or exceeded those of a certain unique subset of abilities. Nobody seemed to realize that Resurrect was an ultimate for a reason. Of course, the developers, in their infinite stupidity, instead of trying a different approach or backtracking, or even instead of persisting in hitting the stubborn but well-advised target, took the dumbest option available. They nerfed Mercy's base healing output. Putting ultimates as cooldown abilities doesn't really work. It's why Mercy hasn't been allowed to be a main healer for 2.5 years, or why Baptiste's Grandmaster pick rate resembles Activision Blizzard's stock value over the past 3 years. Yeah, I'm looking at Immortality Field. Don't act like I don't know where you got that idea from. Resurrect as a basic ability is an incredibly volatile configuration for the concept. Balancing a hero with an Ultimate-on-a-cooldown is incredibly difficult and tedious, and it's nearly impossible to reconcile objective balance with the intended design of the hero simultaneously with such an ability present. The character is either viable, in which case their cooldown ultimate is too good to pass up, or they are not, and you wouldn't consider running them in the first place. The third option is Mercy's case, where the character is in a decent balance state, but is stuck in some kind of limbo design-wise because the cooldown ultimate consumes so much of their power budget. But that's treading into territory I'll cover later. Let's talk about Resurrect itself. The most obvious pain point for the ability is its cast time. Currently, the most enjoyable thing about playing Mercy is the mobility in her base kit. Guardian Angel is by far the most engaging ability in the current iteration of Mercy. I can guarantee you that if Guardian Angel were removed without being replaced by a comparable mobility tool, most current Mercy players would drop the character in a heartbeat. Mobility is just as cardinal, if not more cardinal, to Mercy as it is to Tracer or Lucio. Why then are Mercy players required to endure a near standstill movement restriction repeatedly to justify their hero selection? Successful resurrections are a must to play Mercy effectively. If you are not reviving at least as many times as you are dying, then you are better off playing another support, assuming you can play them at a similar caliber. Every other tangible benefit Mercy provides is overshadowed by Ana and Baptiste. The only contributional edge Mercy has over Ana and Baptiste is Resurrect, the ability tied to a self-incapacitation. To reiterate, in order to justify selecting Mercy over another healer, the player must use an ability that flatly contradicts the design of the hero it is attached to, an ability that is the antithesis of what they likely play Mercy for in the first place. Moreover, Resurrect in its current form serves to revoke every ounce of control from the Mercy player's hands. A successful resurrection depends primarily upon the awareness and attention span of your enemies and the positioning and coordination of your teammates. As soon as you commit to pressing E, what happens in the following 2 seconds is up to everyone else. It's up to your Zarya to bubble you, or your Reinhardt to shield you, or your Ana to heal you, or your Soldier 76 to lay down covering fire for you, or your Pharah to knock the enemies away from you. It's up to the enemy Lucio to boop you, or the enemy McCree to flashbang you, or the Tracer to one-clip you, or the Roadhog to hook you, or the fucking Rat to knock you away. It is more up to the dead ally Resurrect is being used on than it is to the Mercy using the ability in the first place. They at least got to choose where they stood. The Mercy, on the other hand, is too busy emulating a stone to enjoy that luxury. The only agency in using Resurrect comes from deciding whether or not you should use it in the first place, which is an effortless decision for anyone who is halfway decent with any of Mercy's pre-rework versions. Everything else is just a gamble revolving around each team's competence. Now seems like a good time to talk about Mass Resurrect. Mass Resurrect was a metagame of metagames. Playing the pre-rework version of Mercy was like playing an RTS in the first person. Resurrect was incredibly flexible in what it could be used for, but it had to be used carefully. It was the team's failsafe. As I said before, Resurrect was one of 3 abilities in the game designed to counter the team-wiping power of offensive ultimates. In any given game, you'd have 1 or 2 of these defensive ultimates against 4 or 5 enemy offensive ultimates. If shit hits the fan, you need to be sure that you have it and that you are in a position to use it. If you use it before shit hits the fan, then you need to be sure that shit will not hit the fan anytime soon. Like many ultimates, Resurrect could completely change the tide of a fight in your team's favor. However, it could also backfire harder than any other ultimate in the game, especially compared to its counterparts. It was the only ultimate that could, if utilized incorrectly, guarantee a staggered team into the next fight and grant the enemy team additional ultimate charge without any further expense. Get it right, and you can save your team and possibly the game. Get it wrong, and you've potentially thrown the game instead. With this in mind, it's clear that using Mass Resurrect effectively was incredibly important to being a good Mercy. So what makes a good use of Mass Resurrect? This is where I reaffirm my prior Mass Resurrect was complicated statement. You could have 2 situations that are identical except for one very slight difference, and that one deviation could completely change the answer. A complete answer to this question would be an essay in and of itself. It's a good thing you have me, isn't it? Let's start simple. Generally, the more dead teammates you have, the more necessary a use of Mass Resurrect is to recover any chance of winning the fight. Those numbers aren't in a vacuum though, they matter in the context of how many enemies are still in the fight, not just for the moment, but also in the foreseeable future, along with how many allies will return to the fight in the foreseeable future. Now, locations are relevant. A 2-man advantage has a different meaning depending upon whether you're attacking the first objective of Hanamura or the second one. Using Resurrect to turn a 5v3 into a 6v3 on the first point may be superfluous. But perhaps using Resurrect to make a 2-man advantage a 3-man advantage on the second objective will help your team overcome the insane respawn advantage the enemy team has. But then there's even more to consider. What if they have a strong ultimate combo ready straight out of spawn? Now we're looking at enemy ultimates as well. That ultimate combo could pose a massive threat, unless their deaths are staggered in such a way that the combo is impossible. Now we're looking at not just numbers, but specifically who on the enemy team is alive, whether or not they have their ultimate, and what their respawn timer is. Maybe the respawn times line up and you have to save Resurrect for the aftermath of the combo, or maybe you have a second defensive ultimate ready that could be used to mitigate the combo instead. Now we're looking at allied ultimates as well. Of course, your other support needs to be in a position to use their ultimate in the first place. They need to be not dead. Better check to make sure that one dead ally isn't them. How have they been faring against the enemy team for this entire game? Have they been struggling to survive? Could they be killed off before the enemy ultimate combo enters play? Now we're looking at the relative competence and positioning of the two teams and literally predicting who does or does not die next. If your other support is sound, does the enemy team have any abilities, ultimate or otherwise, that are good at countering defensive ultimates? Is there another teammate with their ultimate up that works particularly well against the enemy ultimate combo? If so, team compositions are now relevant. Putting this into a more concrete example, let's suppose the fight is a 5v3 with your team attacking the second objective of Hanamura. Reviving the teammate now may accelerate the meat grinder you've set up on the objective to kill the stalling enemies quicker. It could prevent the enemy from regaining any possible advantage. When considering only these variables, I would say that yes, this is a good time to use Resurrect. But these aren't the only variables in play. What ultimates does the enemy team have? Do they have a Nano Blade combo ready? Do their respawn timers line up so they can use it from spawn? Are they even dead in the first place? Now using Resurrect on the one dead ally seems like a bad idea because you have to have it ready for that contingency. But if you also have a Zenyatta with Transcendence ready, maybe you can depend upon him to counter the Nano Blade. How well has the Zenyatta been playing? Has he been getting picked off early in each fight? Is he the dead teammate right now? If he's been playing well for most of the game, but is the only one dead right now, maybe reviving him would put your team at 6, and then he could protect everyone from the Nano Blade using Transcendence. Or maybe that's still a bad idea because the enemy team has an Ana and she could throw a biotic grenade to nullify Transcendence. What are your other options? Does your team have any other ultimates that could counter their Nano Blade? Does your Soldier 76 have Tactical Visor? If so, is he in a good position to use it? If he's on the objective, he'll likely be killed by Nano Blade before he can neutralize it, and you'll want to have Resurrect ready in case the Nano Blade kills some of your teammates. If he's on the high ground, then he probably has a good chance to neutralize it before it can deal significant damage, and using Resurrect now seems like a good idea. Identifying the best time and place to use Mass Resurrect required a lot of planning. You had to consider contingencies and how your team could deal with them, and if they couldn't, how you could deal with them instead. Even in times where there was no good answer, you could still force a better answer by weakening an enemy with pistol fire before the resurrection and then finishing them off during the invulnerability frames. That's a risky play itself though, and you need to know who you're engaging and what cooldowns they have. Are you keeping up? We've only covered half of the mind games surrounding the ability. That was just the theoretical side of Mass Resurrect. Identifying the correct time and place to use Resurrect for maximum value is great and all, but how are you going to physically pull it off? After all, you are the single highest priority target in the game equipped with almost no offensive capacity. The enemy team will jump, sometimes literally, at a chance to kill you early on. Sure, the enemy today might want you dead, but before the rework, the enemy wanted you dead. Being solo ulted as Mercy was not an uncommon occurrence in the slightest back then. The question then becomes, how do you, as the Mercy player, survive not only the ultimates fired in your team's general direction, but also the enemies who will go out of their way to kill you, and specifically you? The answer comes down to knowing the maps and knowing your enemy. Not just what they have at their disposal, but also how they use those abilities. Are they the kind of team that pokes until they get an advantage and then pushes in? Or do they pop ultimates right out of the gate and hit your team hard and fast? Do they hit your front line, or do they go straight for your back line? How do you position yourself to deal with those threats and still end up in the right place at the right time to use Resurrect as you planned? As Resurrect was the only failsafe that worked retroactively, you, as the Mercy, needed to survive everything your team did not, and then some. You needed to tailor your positioning and mentality to the situation more than any other player in the game. For example, if the threat you are most concerned about from the enemy team is Dragon Blade, then the typical corners you usually hold that are close to your team but out of the enemy's line of sight are no longer sufficient. Instead, you will want to position yourself further from the bulk of your team and use the full length of your beams. This way, it is more difficult for the Genji to turn on you while Dragon Blade is active. Enclosed spaces become less safe, and raw distance becomes top priority. Open spaces that are usually kill zones for Mercy players suddenly become ideal positions to move to, as they provide the most Guardian Angel targets and therefore escape routes. Swift Strike only has 15 meters of range and cooldown resets on eliminations, so if you can bait him to use the ability before flying to a faraway target with Guardian Angel, then you can escape and leave him stranded. You know, the thing Mercy should do if Gensi ever becomes canon. Psych! If the threat you're worried about is Tactical Visor instead, then playing corners becomes a better idea, especially if redundant corners are used. Instead of holding just one corner, you'll want to position yourself near a second one so you can quickly break line of sight should the enemy Soldier 76 push it past the first one. Open spaces are now more risky than before, and the player must find a way to traverse them quickly using Guardian Angel or not at all. Peeking should be kept to a minimum while Tactical Visor is active. Likewise with Earth Shatter, high ground becomes more advantageous, with Rocket Barrage in closed spaces, with Riptire long and narrow sightlines. And then there were the more persistent threats. Flankers. How you responded to them varied depending upon what was happening everywhere else. If there are no impending team wipes, flying to your team for help with a flanker is a great idea. If the enemy team is loaded up with ultimates, flying to the bulk of your team for help could be suicide depending upon the ultimates in play and the positioning of the two teams. Flying closer to your team for support means now the team and its failsafe are in the same location, so the enemy team can fire away without worrying about that failsafe after the dust has settled. In the event that flying to the team is suicide, you would instead want to position so that you can fend off the enemy flankers long enough to execute the necessary resurrection. This means staying near enclosed spaces or health packs. Your objective is not necessarily to kill the enemy flanker, although that would serve you perfectly fine, but to delay them until it is no longer dangerous to play within 5 meters of the rest of your team. All of this then needs to be planned for in reference to where your team is when it is time to activate Resurrect. Where do you need to be to get maximum value out of the resurrection? If the dead teammates are all spread out from each other and the living teammates, who do you prioritize? Do you use Resurrect at all at this point, or will it just result in staggered deaths going into the next fight? What might seem like an awful resurrection on the surface could be a great resurrection in reality. Obviously, in order to adapt to the situation, the player must be aware of it. This means tracking the ultimates, positions, playstyles, and skill levels of both teams. If the player tracks and plans for these variables properly, they are rewarded with a powerful and impactful play that could turn a defeat into a victory. Mass Resurrect created a mind game that was both engaging and rewarding. It forced the player to plan further ahead than what was immediately in front of them. Contingencies were integral to effective utilization. It was a high-risk, high-reward ability where the player had full ownership over the result. It felt incredibly good to use when executed successfully, especially when paired with the surprised and excited exclamations from your teammates affirming that while they may have been down, they were never out. E-Resurrect, on the other hand, has none of these qualities. Using Resurrect to its maximum potential in Mercy's current state isn't a difficult call in the slightest. The best time to use it is universally predefined. It doesn't vary by the specific situation whatsoever. Using it to reverse the first pick in a fight is always the ideal use of Resurrect. It's simple. You can revive one teammate every fight. The older the fight, the more decided it is. Reviving a teammate into a 4v6 only resets your team to a 5v6, leaving you with the same problem you had before. It is hard to stop a snowball. It is easy to prevent one. Moreover, the more teammates you have alive, the more cover you have for that first resurrection. More dead teammates means a lower probability that the resurrection will complete in the first place. There is no stopping to ask, will we need Resurrect later? Resurrect is no longer able to contend with enemy ultimates. The only thing that changes from Resurrect to Resurrect is the location of the dead ally. The question goes from where and when is best to use Resurrect in this fight and how do I accomplish that, to is it suicide to stand there for 2 seconds? You are not asked to consider a multitude of plausible realities and then plan for multiple contingencies. You do not need to know what the enemy team was doing in the last fight so that you can predict what ultimates they have now and how they might behave in this fight. There is no prediction involved. All that is required is a glance at the situation and the question to be asked, if I stand there for 2 seconds, will I die? That is an easy question to answer, not just for veterans of Mercy 1.x, but for anyone who plays any support or DPS. If you can cross a street without getting hit by a car, then you can tell the difference between a viable use of E-Resurrect and a suicidal one. There are no mind games surrounding Resurrect anymore. They simply do not exist. Sure, you can pretend they exist. You can predict the enemy team's moves perfectly 20 seconds in advance if you want. But why bother when there is no reward for doing so? Why bother when you can't actually do anything about it? Nothing will change if you just react to the threat as it becomes obvious compared to you foreseeing it. I still remember how people claimed after the rework and its successive patches that now Mercy players would have to think before they use Resurrect. I recall having a bitter laugh over it because the truth is that when I play Mercy now, I don't think. I just react. I don't plan ahead like I used to. Hell, I don't even track enemy ultimates anymore. There's no reason to. There's no reward for doing so, and there's no punishment for not doing so. And yeah, I could use those skills picked up during Mercy 1.x to make callouts, but the trend I've found is that either the players are smart enough to not need them, or they're too stupid to listen to the callouts at all.
Hogs far right on our sig. Hogs still far right, guys. Hog's gonna hook around in 3, 2, 1.
The removal of Mass Resurrect has made a noticeable difference in my positioning as well. I no longer have to live through that which kills the rest of my team, so I no longer position in a manner specifically tailored to what the enemy team is running. I don't position specifically for health packs, or second corners, or open areas for long Guardian Angel flight paths. Players are better at focusing these days, and yet I get focused less often now than I did before the rework. If I need help against flankers, I fly to my team for support. If the enemy team sees that and then kills all of us with their ultimates, so what? It's not like I could do anything about it, and it's better to die with a team than to stagger my own death anyway. There is no ownership over the result of a resurrection. The success of a resurrection is not defined by careful planning, smart positioning, and surgical aggression. It is defined by where your teammate decided to die and where the two teams are. I did not forge a path to a good resurrect. I looked at the one path that existed and decided whether or not it would end well. You know what the current form of resurrect could use? Some additional player agency. We're not going to get that though, because the player's control over even the availability of the Ultimate-on-a-cooldown was removed when they made it an Ultimate-on-a-cooldown. So yeah, now Mercy's most powerful ability is stuck on a static 30-second cooldown and is completely independent from the player's performance. If you use Resurrect and then pop off with big heals and well-placed damage boosts, you get your next Resurrect in 30 seconds. If you use Resurrect and then promptly die, you get your next Resurrect in 30 seconds. It is a participation award in the form of a crutch when you are playing poorly, and it is an obstruction when you are playing well. No, I don't have Resurrect, but don't worry, I'll have it as soon as we respawn from this lost fight. Like many things about the Mercy rework, the fact that Resurrect was never given a performance-based cooldown or some kind of resource meter is utterly baffling to me. The two main issues with the rework during the Moth meta were that it sucked to play as and that it was brokenly overpowered. Did the developers not realize that a performance-based cooldown on Resurrect is an excellent way to nerf Mercy and simultaneously make her feel less awful to play? If you work the numbers right, you could have a Resurrect that a player could theoretically charge in 20 seconds if they perform particularly well, but also has an average cooldown of 50 seconds. It's a win-win situation. Resurrect is less stupidly overpowered, and Mercy mains are happier. And hey, now I at least have some agency over my most powerful ability. What do I think should be done with Resurrect? There's the obvious option, put it back as Mercy's ultimate, remove the cast time, and adjust its charge requirement accordingly. That would solve two of the issues. We could restrict it specifically to Valkyrie since the cast time is less excruciating while Valkyrie is active. That would also solve two of the issues. We could bring Mass Resurrect back and then apply whatever massive modifications we want there. That could solve all three issues depending upon how it plays out. There are dozens of ideas anyone could come up with to fix Resurrect using modified variants of what has already existed in Overwatch, but I think it's worthwhile to consider how revive mechanics are handled in a game that executes them well. Apex Legends. Yes, Overwatch and Apex Legends are completely different games with entirely different visions. There are some pretty glaring differences that simply cannot be ignored, namely the fact that anyone in Apex Legends can revive, while in Overwatch, only Mercy can. Despite those differences, Overwatch can still learn a lot from Apex when it comes to revive mechanics. The most obvious difference between the two revives at first glance is that the cast time for revives in Apex Legends is much longer than the cast time in Overwatch. And yeah, that would kind of suck for Mercy in Overwatch, but there's more to it than that. In Apex, you can start or cancel a revival at any time. Almost every character in the game has an ability that augments their ability to revive teammates. Bangalore can use her smoke grenade to obscure her from view while she revives her teammates. Caustic can use the same principle with his gas traps and gas grenades. Rampart can place down cover in front of her before reviving her teammates. Wraith can create a portal to a safer location and revive her teammates there. Octane can launch his downed allies away from the fight using his jump pad, and so can Horizon with her gravity lift. Gibraltar can throw his dome, Mirage can use his decoys to create false images of him reviving and can literally turn invisible. Lifeline doesn't need to channel the revive herself. All of these mechanics make revives so much more than just reach your down teammate and stay there for a bit. Even when playing one of the few characters that can't augment their revives, there's still nuance surrounding the mechanic. You see that revive I'm using right in front of the enemy? That's not suicide, that's bait. The enemy will push me, only for me to round the corner and put the barrel of an LMG in their mouth. Why? I cancel the revive at just the right time for the sound effect to continue playing for the next 2 seconds. You can play a similar game by reviving in front of doors, although doors are their own beast when it comes to mind games. Apex Legends shows us that you can have a revive mechanic that is incredibly restrictive while still giving the player full agency over it. You can have meta games around single target mid-fight revivals. Rampart's cover is great and all, but it only works well if the enemy team doesn't lob grenades at you. Caustic's gas and Bangalore smoke can obscure you from the enemy team's view, but only if they don't have a bloodhound or digital threat optics. Specifically in Lifeline's case, you can start a revival and then protect your teammate while they are being revived. That modality is way more engaging, and I would argue way more fitting of a combat medic than being the one needing the protection. You can play Guardian for your teammate until they're back on their feet again. Or dare I say, you get to play Guardian Angel, almost as if the concept is incredibly fitting for Mercy. Does it need to be implemented in the same way? Not necessarily. Just the principle of starting the revive and then protecting your patient in an active manner would suffice, wherein failure to protect your patient would result in the cancellation of Resurrect. The protection could take the form of barriers, pistol fire, directional interceptions like defense matrix, range knockback abilities, hostile damage reductions, some combinations thereof, whatever. The developers could get creative with this. Assuming they ever grow a pair. I'm gonna be honest, I'm sick of writing advertisements for my Discord server. If you haven't already done so, you should join it. Maybe I'll get to stop writing advertisements for it.